The winter light outside Houston was dull and fading when paramedics wheeled a silent, unresponsive man through the sliding glass doors of Baytown Methodist Hospital. The nurses who first examined him could see immediately that something was wrong, something far beyond the usual medical emergency. His vitals were unstable, his insulin levels were violently high, and he wasn't responding to life-saving treatment the way he should. For a diabetic patient, this collapse made no medical sense. But even more unsettling was the woman clinging to his bedside. She was distraught, crying loudly, pacing, begging doctors to save her husband. To the nurses, her grief felt almost theatrical, as if performed for an audience. They didn't say it aloud, but the thought spread through the staff like a quiet shiver. Something about this case wasn't adding up. His name was Joe Hartsfield, a 46-year-old man who worked hard, lived quietly, and rarely asked for anything. He depended on insulin to manage his diabetes, and he relied heavily on the small glucose monitor he kept on his arm, one that sent alerts directly to his phone and to his wife's. Her name was Sarah Hartsfield. Within 8 days, Joe would be gone, and the world around Sarah, the one she had kept carefully shielded for decades, would begin to split open. In the coming minutes, the truth behind Joe's last hours will unravel into a chilling timeline stretching across states, marriages, fires, unexplained deaths, and people who believed they escaped her only by luck. And before we dive deeper, you're watching Unsolved True Crimes. Remember to subscribe. Your support helps us continue uncovering cases that should never be forgotten. Joe's descent began quietly. After being rushed from Beach City to the ER on January 7, 2023, medical teams tried everything to stabilize him. Every method they knew should have worked, but Joe stayed unresponsive, trapped in a deep, unnatural stillness. Nurses checked his records, checked the monitors, checked his charts again. The numbers remained impossible. For 8 long days, doctors fought. Machines hummed. Medications were adjusted. Nothing changed. And while Joe faded, Sarah cried and prayed and posted emotional videos on Facebook. Videos showing her broken beside his hospital bed, stroking his hand, whispering to him like a widow in waiting. On January 15th, Sarah made the decision to end life support. Joe died. His family wasn't there. His body was cremated soon after. The hospital held a moment of silence. Nurses bowed their heads, but behind those bowed heads were questions. Sharp, uncomfortable questions that none of them could shake. Because medical science had already whispered its warning, Joe's insulin levels had peaked 4 to 6 hours before Sarah called 911. His glucose monitor, synced directly to her phone, would have been screaming with alarms for hours. And she claimed she heard nothing. Investigators stepped into the story the moment the inconsistencies reached the sheriff's office. They didn't yet know Joe's past. They didn't yet know Sarah's. But the moment they started asking questions, the edges of the truth began to rise. Inside the couple's bedroom, officers found nearly 10 empty insulin pens scattered on the floor beside Joe's side of the bed. That detail alone sent a cold wave through the investigative team. Combined with Sarah's claim that she slept undisturbed all night, while the monitor she shared with Joe supposedly blared alert after alert, nothing made sense. And Sarah's explanation didn't mend the gap. She told investigators she had been dealing with her own medical issues, that she'd fallen asleep hard, that insulin alarms went off all the time anyway. There was no reason to panic, she said, but the alarms had gone off. Over and over. Hours before Joe collapsed. The more they pressed, the more they realized something else. Sarah had moved through life like a woman followed by smoke. Fires, death, chaos, and fear seemed to appear behind her no matter where she went. But somehow, she had walked away untouched every time. A diabetic man dying suddenly wasn't unusual. A diabetic man dying suddenly while married to her? That was different. And so investigators dug deeper into her past and found that her life was not simply complicated. It was a labyrinth, one lined with broken marriages, terrified ex-husbands, unexplained tragedies, and a trail of people who claimed they barely escaped her alive. To understand what happened to Joe, they needed to begin at the beginning. Sarah Smith grew up in rural Missouri, surrounded by farmland and open country. To an outsider, it looked peaceful, a place fit for a quiet childhood. But behind the walls of her family's home, nothing was idyllic. Her father, Thomas Smith, had a criminal record and a violent temper. After his release from prison, the abuse he inflicted on Sarah became so severe that she was removed from the home and placed in foster care at a young age. Her foster mother described her as troubled but incredibly intelligent, sharp in a way that made her stand out. Sarah didn't just observe the world, she studied it, calculated it, adapted to it. Those who knew her would later describe that intelligence as both magnetic and frightening. By her teenage years, her life had already begun to drift into patterns that would follow her forever. She married young, far too young, to a high school sweetheart named Titus Keel. The marriage lasted less than 3 years. What Titus discovered after returning from military training stunned him. Several people openly admitted they'd been having affairs with Sarah. Their marriage dissolved quickly, but Sarah never really let him go. For nearly 25 years after their divorce, Titus said he felt hunted. He claimed she stalked him, called his home repeatedly, harassed his second wife, vandalized his vehicles, and once soaked the outside of his house in gasoline while he and his family were inside. He remembered the smell, the sharp burn of fuel in the night. When he walked outside to investigate, he saw her slipping away into the darkness. Police reports were filed. Protective orders were requested. Nothing stuck. Every time, Sarah talked her way out of it. Her charm was a weapon, and she knew exactly how to use it. Her second marriage lasted barely longer, ending abruptly. Though that husband seemed to escape the fallout, others didn't. Then came the uniform. In 1997, Sarah joined the U.S. Army. For the next 20 years, she served as both a motor transport operator and later an intelligence analyst. She rose to the rank of Sergeant First Class, a position that required discipline, precision, and control. Those who served with her said she was whip-smart, capable, and always alert, the kind of person who made a powerful first impression. But that impression never lasted, because beneath the discipline was someone who unraveled slowly, angry, manipulative, controlling, and prone to sudden chaos. In Alaska, where she was first stationed, she met her third husband, Christopher Donahue, a soldier like her. They married, had 4 children, and built what looked like a stable life. But inside that home, the same patterns began to grow again. Affairs, rage, control, children who said they lived in fear of her, reports to Child Protective Services that went nowhere. But something darker happened in that home, something that wouldn't surface until years later. Sarah invited her biological father, Thomas Smith, the same man who had abused her as a child, to stay with her while he was sick. She said he had nowhere else to go. Within 3 days, he was dead. Her daughter remembered watching her mother give Thomas his medications, then hearing him cough, clutch his chest, and collapse. Years later, while sitting in a county jail cell for Joe's death, Sarah would claim she did nothing wrong. She said she simply cared for him. But investigators in multiple states now question that story. And the deeper they looked, the more they found. House fires, inheritance disputes, relationships ending with flames and smoke. One ex-boyfriend's home caught fire shortly after he cut ties with her. Her grandmother's home, filled with land, property, and inheritance disputes, was destroyed the same night Sarah argued with her brother over who deserved what. She had shown up uninvited with a U-Haul earlier that day. When the fire marshal questioned her the next morning, her arms and face were covered in poison ivy, plants that only grew at the back of the property, near where investigators believed the fire had started. But like always, the case went nowhere. Again and again, she walked away. By the time investigators reached the year 2018, they were already overwhelmed. But nothing in her past struck them harder than what happened in Garfield, Minnesota, an event that now sits at the center of multiple reopened investigations. Her fiancé, David Bragg, was shot through the heart. Sarah said it was self-defense. At the time, authorities believed her. Today, not everyone does. But that part of the story comes later. For now, investigators in Texas simply stood in shock as the pieces of Sarah's life began forming a pattern. David Bragg's home sat on a quiet street in Garfield, Minnesota, a place where people rarely locked their doors, where neighbors waved from their porches, and where nothing violent ever seemed to touch the landscape. But on the night deputies were called there in May 2018, nothing about that small town felt peaceful. Inside the house, lying near the base of the staircase, was David. One gunshot, one wound to the heart, a life that had steadied so many others suddenly gone. Sarah was the only surviving witness. When deputies arrived, she told the story calmly. She said she'd come by the house to pick up items for one of her daughters. She said David confronted her, jealous, angry, irrationally upset, after learning that her ex-husband had visited with their child earlier that day. She said she felt trapped, cornered at the top of the staircase. She said he reached for one of the guns she kept with her. She said he fired first. She said she dove, terrified. And then she said she returned fire without aiming, somehow striking him perfectly in the chest. Detectives studied her face. They studied her tone. They studied every detail. And then they studied the evidence. The bullet trajectory down the stairs was consistent with her claim that David fired toward her. But something about the scene felt staged. Something was too neat, too aligned, too clean to belong to a frantic, chaotic struggle. Yet, in the absence of contradictory evidence, prosecutors closed the case. They determined she'd acted in self-defense. And just like that, David Bragg's death joined the long list of violent events that surrounded Sarah, each one quietly absorbed into the shadows. But while the law stepped aside, David's family never did. To them, the narrative was impossible. David was a gentle man, soft-spoken, calm, devoted to his children. He was the kind of father who checked the back seat twice before driving, the kind of brother who showed up for every birthday, every graduation, every gathering. He wasn't violent. He wasn't unpredictable. And he wasn't someone who fired a gun at the woman he planned to marry. His family believed he wanted out of the relationship. They said he'd been trying to pull away. They said his spark had dimmed in the months leading up to his death. And they said the last time they spoke to him, he seemed drained, exhausted by something he didn't want to say aloud. They felt deep in their bones that the moment David tried to leave, he became another name on Sarah's list of men who didn't survive her orbit. But they couldn't prove it. Not then. Sarah moved forward quickly. After being cleared, she brought another man into the home she'd shared with David. She married again. Husband number 4, a quiet Minnesota gas company employee named David George, who had fallen into her life after visiting the property for work. He had no idea the life he was stepping into. Christopher Donahue, Sarah's third husband, was remarried now, building a new life with his wife Heather. And after their wedding, something inside Sarah seemed to ignite. The bitterness that had simmered through their divorce broke open. According to Christopher, she stopped following custody agreements. She refused to turn over their daughters when she was supposed to. She fought him on every detail. And then, in 2021, the situation crossed a terrifying line. Christopher said David George came to him with a confession that Sarah had asked him to kill Heather, to remove the woman from the equation, to derail Christopher's future, to distract him so completely with grief that he'd drop his pursuit of custody, that he'd collapse under the weight of tragedy. Sarah had even given David George a gun, Christopher said. She'd told him not to come home until the job was done. David George drove across state lines to Arizona, where the Donahues lived. He arrived at their doorstep with a fake flower delivery, but Heather wasn't the one who answered the door. Christopher did. David turned around, got back in his vehicle, drove away. He later claimed he never intended to hurt anyone. He said he didn't have the gun with him that day, but the detail that haunted investigators most was the simple fact that he went, that he stood at the door, that he was willing to let Sarah believe he was following her instructions. And then he vanished from her life. When he returned to Minnesota without committing the act, Sarah allegedly locked him out of the house and filed for divorce. The FBI briefly monitored the Donahues' home after Christopher reported the alleged plot, but without firm evidence, no charges were filed. The story dissolved into the background. Another violent allegation, another eerie near-miss, another moment where pain swirled around Sarah but somehow never touched her. Yet the sequence was changing. The pattern was becoming visible. And everything around her life seemed to fall into predictable categories. Men she loved, men she controlled, men she feared losing, and men who either walked away shaking or didn't walk away at all. As investigators in Texas continued piecing together her history after Joe's death, David Bragg's case re-entered the light. Along with that case came another quiet tragedy, the unexpected death of a woman named Rebecca "Becky" Kunze, who had spent years involved with Sarah's fourth husband, David George. Becky had passed away in January 2018. Her death was attributed to a heart valve issue at the time. She had struggled with medical problems before, so the explanation was accepted. But now, with investigators retracing every thread connected to Sarah, Becky's death didn't sit as neatly as it once had. And, in a strange twist, months after Becky died, David George's house caught fire. Another fire. Another tragedy. Another coincidence that didn't feel like coincidence anymore. The walls were closing in. And then, in 2022, Sarah met Joe. He was kind, quiet, a man who loved fishing, family, and structure. A man who wanted a stable marriage, a steady life, a home without chaos. Sarah charmed him quickly. They dated for a few months. They married even faster. Less than 4 weeks after their engagement, they stood together, exchanging vows. To Joe's family, she seemed warm, polished, confident. For a moment, they believed she was a blessing. But by December, just months into the marriage, everything was unraveling. Sarah wrote online that Joe had mommy issues. She complained to her daughter that she was done with him. Joe, meanwhile, whispered to family members that he was afraid. He didn't feel safe. He was trying to leave quietly, making plans beneath the surface. Plans he told only a few people about. He opened a new bank account in Huntsville, close to where his family lived. He planned to move in with them. Every morning he left home early, long before he needed to, just to avoid being in the house with her. 4 days before he collapsed, Joe asked Sarah for a divorce. 4 days. And 2 days before he was taken to the hospital, he was actively planning the final steps of his escape. He spoke of packing his things. He spoke of timing. He spoke of leaving soon. But before he could leave, his body betrayed him. Or someone else did. The night he spiraled into medical crisis, Sarah claimed she slept straight through. She said she heard nothing. She said the insulin alarms on their shared phone application, alarms that would have sounded as his blood sugar spiked to catastrophic levels, didn't wake her. When Joe's older daughter arrived at the hospital and saw the machines, she cried so hard she could barely breathe. She knew her father. She knew how careful he was with his health. She knew how meticulous he was with insulin. She knew this didn't happen naturally. And then Joe died. And Sarah cried online, and the hospital staff whispered among themselves. And the investigators dug deeper. On February 3, 2023, Sarah was arrested. Charged with murder, held on a $5 million bond. She went into court in shackles, speaking softly, shaking her head at every accusation. She said her husband died from a medical emergency, nothing more. She said she was innocent. She said the truth had been twisted. Her attorney said the state lacked evidence. He said the discovery packets were thin, no medical examiner's report, no complete police report. He said the accusations were sensationalized. And still, everywhere investigators looked, they found something darker. Her father's sudden death, house fires tied to disputes, ex-husbands terrified of her, a fiancé shot through the heart, a woman dead under unexplored circumstances, a murder plot with a reluctant hitman, a fourth husband allegedly manipulated into something horrific, and a fifth husband, Joe, dead from insulin levels no one could explain. Investigators in multiple states reopened files. The death of her father in 2015, the shooting of David Bragg in 2018, the death of Becky Kunze in 2018, the fire at David George's home, even the alleged plot in Arizona. The weight of her past was finally being measured. But despite everything stacked against her, she pushed forward with fierce certainty. She replaced her court-appointed attorney. She fought for lower bond. She gave interviews from the jail. She said she was being unfairly crucified. She said she picked horrible husbands, nothing more. And through it all, the question that hovered in every room where investigators met was a simple one. How had she escaped scrutiny for so long? The answer was buried somewhere in the lives of the people she left behind, those who survived her, those who mourned because of her, and those who still wondered how many tragedies one life could attract before someone stopped the pattern. And now, anchored by Joe's death, that pattern had finally come into full view. Her trial date hovered on the horizon, delayed, debated, pushed back by her legal team. The case's complexity made even seasoned prosecutors pause. And until a jury heard her story, examined her life, and weighed the evidence, she remained legally innocent. But behind closed doors, in quiet conversations, in the voices of those who once loved her or feared her, a different truth echoed. Every time someone tried to leave her life, something catastrophic happened. And Joe had tried to leave. 4 days before everything collapsed, Joe Hartsfield's death was supposed to be the end of the story. At least, that's how Sarah framed it online, posting heartbreak, grief-soaked messages, and videos of herself holding his hand in the hospital, whispering that she didn't know how to live without him. She wrote about feeling numb. She wrote about listening to his old voicemails on repeat. She asked the world to pray for her, but the people closest to Joe didn't see grief in her eyes at the hospital. They saw something else, something hollow, something practiced, something that felt like a performance. And as investigators continued peeling back the layers of her life, they reached a point where coincidence could no longer be the explanation. There were too many men who had feared her. Too many fires that started when she was angry. Too many deaths that happened when someone stood in her way. Too many stories told in whispers by people relieved to still be alive. The timeline of Sarah's life didn't read like the story of a woman who'd stumbled into tragedy. It read like the story of someone who carried tragedy with her from home to home, marriage to marriage, state to state, like a storm cloud that refused to drift away. The investigators who reopened her father's case were blunt. They didn't have enough evidence yet to rewrite the initial finding of natural causes. But they also couldn't ignore the testimony of family members who remembered that night. The idea that a woman might ask her fourth husband to kill the new wife of her third husband sounded almost cinematic, much too extreme for reality. But the details were right there in statements, affidavits, and interviews. The gun she allegedly gave David George, the order she allegedly repeated, the moment David stood at the Donahue door with a fake delivery, the patrol car sent quietly by the FBI to watch over the home, the abrupt divorce that followed when David failed to carry out her wishes. While she sat in the Chambers County Jail, Sarah spoke to the press through phone calls and written messages. She said she was being unfairly vilified. She said the media was twisting everything. She said people from her past were motivated by hate, jealousy, or bitterness. She said the allegations were ridiculous. She said she was innocent. But even her attorney acknowledged the complexity of the case, telling reporters that prosecutors were focusing heavily on her past because the present lacked certain documents. There was no final medical examiner's determination of homicide, no completed police report, no smoking gun. But there were patterns. There were inconsistencies. There were years of fear trailing behind her. There were men who said she threatened their lives. And there were families who believed she had already slipped through the cracks too many times. In March 2023, a panel of doctors reviewed Joe's full autopsy records. Their conclusion was chilling. Joe died from complications of insulin toxicity, an overdose, but they couldn't label it homicide based on medical science alone. The manner of death remained undetermined. To the investigators, that didn't clear Sarah. It simply meant that the truth behind Joe's final moments depended entirely on everything they had uncovered about her, and everything they continued to uncover. As they dug deeper, they learned Joe had told friends he feared for his life. He'd said he believed Sarah would kill him if he tried to leave. He'd packed plans quietly. He'd opened a new bank account. He was preparing his escape. 4 days after asking for a divorce, he was in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to save himself. His glucose monitor had screamed warnings for hours before Sarah called for help. And at the heart of the investigation was one final, painful truth. Joe knew he needed to leave her. He knew his time was running out. He knew the danger, but he didn't know how quickly danger would arrive. As the investigation expanded into multiple states, Sarah's legal team fought aggressively in court. They requested delays. They changed strategies. They replaced attorneys. They argued for lower bond and succeeded multiple times. Her bond dropped from $5 million to $2 million, but she remained behind bars. Still, the delays grew longer. Her attorneys warned that the case was too complex. They said a trial might not begin for a year or two. They said the state was piecing together a puzzle that stretched across decades, one they believed had nothing to do with Joe's death. But to everyone else, the pieces fit together perfectly. For the first time in her life, Sarah couldn't outrun the shadows. The stories of those who came before Joe, those who survived her, those who didn't, those who feared her, were now echoing through courtrooms and sheriff's offices. The sorrow of the families she left behind was no longer quiet. The tragedies that once burned alone were now merged into a single, unsettling narrative. On October 8, 2025, A Chambers County jury found Sarah Hartsfield guilty of murder in the death of her fifth husband, Joseph.
We, the jury, having found the defendant guilty of murder, assess her punishment at confinement in the institutional division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for life, and in addition to such confinement, assess a fine in the amount of $10,000.
She was convicted for giving her husband a lethal dose of insulin and holding off on calling 911. County court records show that Sarah Hartsfield filed a notice of appeal for her conviction and sentence. She will never again be able to walk away from tragedy untouched. And if you follow Joe's story, the echoes of his past, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, where we continue giving a voice to cases that can't speak for themselves. Your comments help us shine a light on stories that deserve to be remembered.